This specific review isn't going to be covering the cards from like lowest mana cost to highest mana cost like other ones. Since these cards are fresh off the press, I'm just taking them off the Hearthstone Facebook site, so they are pretty randomly ordered, and for the most part I'm just going to go through it in no particular order. So let's go ahead and start off with Arcane Blast. Mage, 1 mana, deal 2 damage to a minion. So Mage didn't have a 1 mana deal 2 damage card before, like Holy Smite and Arcane Shot. A control mage might have wanted a 1 mana deal 2 damage to a minion, I suppose. The spell gets double bonus from spell damage, which is nice in terms of like kind of cool synergy. The bad news is it can only hit minions with it, so it's hard to like build a deck around it unless it were like a spell damage deck. You have that champion for spell damage card, which is not actually good enough to warrant a spell damage deck, first of all. Basically, just because there isn't the utility in being able to hit the face with this card, I'm a little bit meh on it. Like 1 mana deal 2 damage to just a minion, it doesn't seem to have quite enough effect to actually be a card. Like 1 mana deal 2, that's fair, and if you have just even +1 spell damage, then you're actually doing 1 mana deal 4, but it's only to minions. It's a neat card, but meh. In Arena, this will actually be just fine because 1 mana deal 2 to minions usually is the way that Arcane Shot and Holy Smite work. Bear Trap, that's a fun card. A lot of streamers have made the pun already, so I'm going to refrain. Not even the pun, but just the joke about the card. Anyways, it's a very cool Hunter Trap. Efficient, because it's 2 mana for a 3/3 Bear with Taunt. Very cool. Introduces the mind game of the Bear Trap, Snake Trap, Freezing Trap. The Hunter is really getting the hook up with these traps. I think the Hunter has been the best designed class for the secrets so far, because each time you attack into a secret, you actually don't really know what the best order to do it in, and sometimes the Freezing Trap just holds you back. And sometimes the Bear Trap, in this case, is going to hold you back from hitting the face, because you can't quite deal with a 3/3 Bear with Taunt. So it turns out that 2 mana for a 3/3 Bear is pretty good value, and even better when you have a 2 mana 2/2 Mad Scientist, which has Death Rattle, summon a 3/3 Bear with Taunt. That's basically 5 mana worth of value onto 1 card, with the Mad Scientist and the Iron for Grizzly. More realistically 4 mana, because the Mad Scientist really is not like worth 2 mana, more like 1.5, and a 3/3 Bear with Taunt is not really worth 3 mana, Iron for Grizzly, but it's more worth like 2.5 mana, so it's more like 4 mana. Of course, when the opponent hits your face, the trap is sprung and the bear attacks them. It's a good card. In Arena, this card will also just be good, just because it is a 2 mana 3/3, and it's difficult to play around. Because it's difficult to hold off on attacking the opponent's face to stop a 3/3 Bear of Taunt. It's not impossible. You can play around it a little bit, like Explosive Trap, in that you don't actually have to attack the face. If you don't want to spawn a 3/3 Bear, you don't have to attack the face, and you can just keep trading minions and like wait. Technically, it doesn't do anything the turn that it's played, because your opponent actually has to step on the trap. It's going to be difficult to hold off on that, and the 3/3 Bear of Taunt is usually going to be relevant. Should actually just see play straight in many of the Hunter decks. So, great card. Good card in Arena too. 2 mana 3/3, that's pretty good. There's a slight interesting interaction with Explosive Trap, in the sense that Explosive Trap says when your hero is attacked, deal 2 damage, and Bear Trap says after your hero is attacked. So presumably, if the card blows up to Explosive Trap, your Bear Trap doesn't get activated, but you probably wouldn't play both cards together anyways. Basically, your opponent's going to attack your face, and then you're going to get a bear. And no, the bear will not block the card that attacks your face, but it'll be there in the future. 2 mana for a 3/3, even though it's delayed. That's very fair and a cool card. I will go ahead and say that the Grand Tournament has really upped its game in terms of puns. Good job. Oh, Bolf, Ramshield. This is really interesting because when I'm clicking next, I actually have no idea what card I'm going into. And it's like, okay, so, whoa, legendary! In terms of stats, the golden standard is the Boulder Fist Ogre, which is 13 stats for 6 mana. This card is 12 stats for 6 mana, but does have a nice ability, a very unique ability attached onto it. Some people have always been like, oh man, I want there to be a taunt for spells. This card is basically that. This card isn't very good at minion combat because they can just hit your face and then kill Bolf Ramshield without taking damage. I think it might have been interesting for Bolf to also have taunt, but this card isn't actually that good. Like, some people will be like, oh no, rip aggro, but you're paying 6 mana for 9 health. If you really wanted to do that, you could play Healing Touch and then gain 8 health for 3. And the attack value doesn't really matter as much because you just hit the face and kill Bolf without taking any retaliation damage. So realistically, this is more of an anti-spell card. It's worth mentioning that sometimes I imagine you can get some really awkward plus value on Bolf, because whenever your hero takes damage, this minion takes it instead, which means that if Bolf were down to like 1 health, then when the opponent pyroblasts you, Bolf would take 10. But yeah, Bolf basically is costing, I think, 1 mana too much. You can basically qualify Healbot as like a 5 mana 3/11 if you compare it to Bolf, because you gain the 8 and then you also get a 3/3. So I think this card is just outclassed by anti-Killbot in normal minion combat. But when it comes to specifically dealing with spells, basically taunts the spells from your face, and that's probably the best you're gonna get. Bolf basically preemptively lets you heal whenever you're taking damage with weapons and with Warlock hero ability. But if you were wanting to do that, you could always just play Healbot anyways. So if you're at 30, you can just play Bolf and then you can tap. But 6 mana for a 3/9, nah. Comboing with Divine Spirit is pretty interesting because you're basically gaining 9 health off of Divine Spirit then. But that's like too combo wombo for this specific card. You're paying 8 mana for the chance to get silenced and then do nothing. An interesting inner fire target too, but really when you start talking about how cards can be interesting when you put Divine Spirit and inner fire on it, it's like, too weak. In Arena, this card is actually going to be worse than Boulder Fist Ogre because Arena is dominated by minion combat, and Bolf is worse than a Boulder Fist Ogre. Boneguard Lieutenant. So we got a 2 mana 3/2, which is, fine for the baseline. A very timid effect, inspire gain +1 health. Not much to say here, it's a fair card. You basically have the choice to play it fairly as a 2 mana 3/2, and then like later on when you're using hero powers you gain a minor benefit, sure. You can also just play it as a 4 mana 3/3 while you're playing the hero power. It's nice and flexible, it's not bad, but it's not something that's good enough to make it into Constructed. In Arena, this card's pretty good, because 2 mana 3/2 is already like average, slightly above average, something. And just getting the extra benefit of gaining health on it is that extra nice juice. So, great Arena card. Another pirate for the rogues. With this card, you can play it on turn 1 in your aggressive pirate decks. That's usually the deck that it would fit into. Pirate decks tend to be aggressive, or perhaps they can be a control-y deck with weapon-based cards. This card is very comparable to the Auto Barber, which is a 2 mana 3/2. You give your weapon +1 attack. With the Buccaneer, you actually have to play it and then equip a weapon that can be your hero power, that can be any other weapon. 1 mana 2/1 versus the 2 mana 3/2 pirate, so nice small synergy there. Ultimately, kind of mediocre, I think. But, another option for you pirates out there are. In Arena, this card's going to be one of the better 1 mana 2/1s. In a way, this is kind of like Deadly Poison. Maybe if I think about this from that Arena perspective, it becomes less bad. Because usually you would do weapon up Deadly Poison, and then you would get a 3/2 weapon. Buccaneer can be actually compared a lot with Deadly Poison. You just do it the other way around. So instead of weapon up Deadly Poison, you play Buccaneer weapon. And then instead of getting a 3/2 weapon, you have a 2/2 weapon, and you have a 2/1. When I think of it that way, it suddenly doesn't seem quite as bad. A lot of the problem with snip, snip, snip that Goblin Auto Barber was that your turn 3 play was kind of awkward. Your turn 2 play was also kind of awkward. Like, you can't play the Auto Barber on turn 2 because you don't have the weapon. And you can't play it on turn 3 because you can't do weapon Auto Barber. But Buccaneer you can actually play on turn 3. You just do Buccaneer and then weapon. And that kind of works out. Instead of having to deal with an extra, like, 1 attack on your weapon twice, compared to Deadly Poison, you get it to 1. And the more I talk about it, the more I think this is, like, actually fine. And that's pretty much as powerful of a 1 mana card minion you could have made. So, cool card. In Arena, probably can be compared to Abusive Sergeant. It basically gives something +2 attack, in this case your weapon. So, like an average to slightly above average card. So one of the interesting things about the Grand Tournament is that they've introduced quite a few new different attack health values, and that I actually do appreciate. This is one such crazy new attack/health distribution. You're paying 7 mana for 14 of stats. War Golem wasn't good, mostly because it could get BGH'd. It turns out a 7 mana 6/8 would be better than War Golem. So this card is better than War Golem. That's about all I can say. One more thing that's worth mentioning is this is a crazy random beast to get from your Ram Wrangler. That's value. There's a lot of interesting dragon synergy in this set. This is like almost Blackrock Mountain version 2 as a minor theme. There's some good dragons. A lot of people look at this and are like, oh, deal 3 damage to all minions. That's what I want, to kill all those Grim Patrons out there. But it kind of is a little bit similar to Sylvanas when you think about the anti-patron. And it's actually just kind of similar to Sylvanas. Your usual goal would be to trade into Sylvanas or this minion with all of your minions and then like have nothing left, so that the death rattle does nothing. So I'm basically saying that about both Sylvanas and Chillmaw. It does escape the BGH, which is good. It is a dragon, which is good. And it has Taunt, which is obviously good. When you think about it, Hellfire is a pretty good card. And Hellfire is 4 mana. So if you attach the Hellfire onto this card and you make the 7 subtract 4, it's like you're paying 3 mana for a 6/6 taunt. So that's pretty good. But here's the thing. It's not really fair to say that because the taunted minion attached with a Hellfire effect doesn't work out that way, because they usually trade off the minions that would get Hellfired, and then Chillmaw blows up and then kills all the guys that would have gotten Hellfired anyways. A slight benefit over Hellfire is it doesn't do damage to face, which is usually what you want in the case of dragons, because dragons you would tend to be running a control deck where your health is better than the opponent's health. It's an option for those dragon decks, and obviously you would put it in a dragon deck because you wouldn't just be running a 7 mana 6/6 taunt. That wouldn't be good enough. Ultimately, it might still be a little too high cost for it. I'm reminded most of Trogzor, which is a card that many people reviewed in Goblins vs. Gnomes as insane, which was also 7 mana 6/6. Its effect was so good that one could basically say it had taunt. But as it just turns out, 7 mana for 6/6 wasn't quite good enough. So when I look at this card, I see a lot of similarities with Trogzor in the stats to mana cost and not being that good. I see a lot of similarities to Sylvanas in that it board controls the way that you want Sylvanas to. It's a little bit more active than Sylvanas because it has taunt. It has more stats. It's a dragon. It's an option for your dragon decks, but certainly not a auto include. You can consider my view on this to be slightly pessimistic. I just think it's an option, and not too big an option, but an option. In Arena, 7 mana 6/6 taunt. Is that even good enough with that? You're not really going to have the dragon synergy. And this card's going to be like average to slightly below average in terms of comparison to legendaries in Arena. Competitive Spirit, it's a cool new secret type. No one has ever seen this type of secret yet because it's the first of its kind. It's a secret that actually auto-completes on your turn. Something really important, which isn't entirely obvious, is that this doesn't trigger if you have no minions on the board. And that's a big deal because if you had no minions on the board and Competitive Spirit triggered, you would be really sad. Pretty much the goal of this card is to play it on turn 1, and then turn 2 you muster for battle. And then you get 3 2/2s. You get an extra 1/1 for every single guy which survives. And that's something that's reasonable, but you have to have the coin. Or you play this on turn 1, and then on turn 3 you muster, but by then they might have some way to kill all your stuff. I'm not very optimistic about this one either, because there's going to be so many situations where your opponent's going to leave one of your minions up, or they're going to be successful in leaving one of your minions up, and then you've paid 1 mana for +1/+1. In Arena, this card is going to be really hard to set up, so it's going to be a really bad card in Arena. 4 mana, 3/5, reasonable stats if the card text is good. The card text isn't quite good enough, so I like to compare this card to Suit Spewer. With this card, you would need to use it once, use your hero power once to have a 4 mana 3/5 spell damage +1. It's just not gonna work. There's some crazy things you can think about where you play this and then it somehow survives the board, and then you play your Kvaldir Drake and then you hero power 5 times, maybe at a discounted mana cost, and then you get +5 on your Dalaran Aspirant, and then you have Malygos, but that's not going to work. It's too slow. In Arena, this card is basically going to be a 4 mana 3/5 without Taunt, so you compare it with Tazingo, and it's going to be less good than it. So no. You got a 3 mana 3/3, very similar to Raging Worgen, except it's easier to trigger this one's Wind Fury. All you have to do is press the button, but it has all the problems that Raging Worgen did, that the turn you played, it's a 3 mana 3/3. With this one, not only is it only a 3 mana 3/3, you actually need to press a button in addition every single turn. It could probably say Inspire, gain Wind Fury, and it still wouldn't be good enough. In fact, let me put it this way. It could say 3 mana 3/3, Wind Fury, and it still wouldn't be good. Wait, why does this card even exist? Alright, in Arena, this card isn't good. We've got Elemental Destruction. This is a whopper of a card. I really like the design on this one. Yes, it says Overload 5. No, that's not a typo. But it's completely fair because Flame Strike is a good card. And you add the 5 to the 3, and that's basically 8 mana for a slightly better Flame Strike. Not only that, Shaman is the class which has the most access to spell damage. You just press the hero power, and sometimes you get spell damage. The fact that it says 4 to 5 isn't as big a deal, because you just count on the 4, and even if it were just deal 4 damage to all minions, that would be fine. Oh, it's to all minions! You know, it didn't have to say all minions. I think I wouldn't have been surprised if it said to all enemy minions, but turns out it's all minions. That makes it worse. I had earlier been saying that when that Joust Shaman healing card was revealed, would be a nice, very low minion deck, and then you use Ancestors Call. Elemental Destruction would be a nice card to stall, so I can see it in that deck. And of course, you combo it with Lava Shock, and then it's basically like you paid 3 mana to deal 4 to 5 damage. I like the card design. I actually think it's a good card. It might not see that much play, but nonetheless, I think it's a good card. It fits the Control Shaman style. When I say it fits the Control Shaman style, I guess I will say more of the specifically low minion count control style, and perhaps more of the combo style of Shaman, which isn't a deck yet, but I'm slightly optimistic that the Ancestors Call deck is going to be a thing. In Arena, for the same reason why Hellfire is good, Elemental Destruction will be reasonably okay. Usually when you're a mage and it's in the late game in Arena, you're basically paying all of your mana to Flame Strike, and sometimes you're going to do it while you have nothing on the board and you're catching up. So in that sense, Elemental Destruction kind of works. and you can even do Elemental Destruction and have enough mana left over to like play your threat. So should be average to good in Arena. So I've got a 2-mana 3/2 beast here. Man, that Bloodfen Raptor just got rocked. King's Elekk will also give you the option sometimes to make it a 2-mana 3/2 draw a card. Draw a minion in specific. So it's a great card. And I also like this card because it pushes a more control-heavy, more late-game hunter. Might even be good enough to just put this into mid-range hunter. Specifically not hybrid hunter, maybe a slightly bigger mid-range hunter. You know, the one that runs Savannah Highmanes and Dr. Boom, and then you joust the opponent and then you get a Dr. Boom. It's a nice value card. Obviously a 2-mana 3/2 draw a card would be insane. You add the beast tag onto it, that's even better. You can get Houndmaster value from it, you can get the Ram Wrangler value from it. You would adjust the minion probability of your deck a bit to try to win the joust too much, but you wouldn't like completely gut your deck. This might make Web Spinner be cut from your deck, but it's good. In Arena, this card is actually going to be really good. It might be one of the best cards in Arena, because you have the chance, on top of a 2-mana 3/2, which is already fair, of just drawing a card, and that's really good. It does tell your opponent what card you have, but that doesn't matter too much, I would say. Like, it's a slight disadvantage because they know specifically on a certain mana turn they might expect you to play that card and they can plan around it a little bit, but still, it's a good card. So, I had been alluding to how Beast Druid could be a thing if there had been more Beast cards, Beast Synergy cards pushed in Druid, and Knight of the Wild is one such synergy card. Well, first of all, we want to ask the question, how much mana do we want to pay for a 6/6? We don't want to pay 7 for it. We don't want to pay 6 for it because we get Boulderfist Ogre, which isn't good enough. We don't really want to pay 5 for it, but 5 is where it starts to be, okay. But realistically, if there were a 5-mana 6/6 vanilla Druid card, that would probably be reasonably fair, kind of, because class cards are supposed to be a little bit better. You compare the 5-mana card to Druid of the Claw, which is a 4/6 taunt for 5 mana, and I think 5 mana for a 6/6, that would make it like slightly good. It's when you start paying like 4 mana for it that it would be really good. So in order for you to pay 4 mana for it, you would have to summon 3 beasts. The unfortunate thing about this is it suffers from the same problem that Bolvar 4-Dragon does, that you have to have Knight of the Wild in your hand while you summon the beasts. And that's a big problem because, well, actually it's not as big a problem as Bolvar. I was about to say, because if you draw it later, then you've already cast all your beasts, but it turns out that then it's still a 7-mana 6/6, and when you draw it later, that's when you actually have 7 mana. And then it's also awkward, like, would you keep this in your opening hand? Since then you only have 2 or 3 more cards to play with, and how are you going to get your curve on if you have this? Basically, it is a beast synergy card, but it may not be quite good enough to be used, because summoning 3 beasts while this is in your hand is difficult. So not quite good enough to push the beast theme, and therefore not quite good enough, I would say. In Arena, 7 mana 6/6 isn't good, and 6 mana 6/6 is actually not that bad, but still not good. So probably a below average card, but not abysmal in Arena. Kvaldir Raider. This is basically Floating Watcher, except it's neutral. Floating Watcher, even if neutral, would probably not really be played. So this card won't be played. In Arena, this card will also probably not be quite good enough. It turns out that Floating Watcher was overvalued by a lot of people in Arena when it first came out. It's just really difficult to justify the 5-mana 4/4 or a 7-mana 6/6. When you play it with a hero power, you're kind of getting like 7-mana 7/7 worth of value if you consider using your hero power to be worth roughly a 1/1. Yeah, probably not quite good enough in Arena. Amal said this card was OP in Arena. Why? He didn't play enough Arena. Alright, we got a Warrior Class card. It has that Foe Reaper effect. But the bad news is, just like Foe Reaper, you couldn't guarantee that you're going to get an attack off. And Foe Reaper even had 9 health on it. So Magnataur Alpha only has 3. That's not going to be enough. So 4 mana 5/3, no. And no, it's not worth charging. In Arena, also no, because your 2 mana 3/2 is going to be pretty common, and if it trades with this 4 mana 5/3, you're going to be sad. Alright, 4 mana 3/4. We've got Summon a Random Murloc. So 4 mana 3/4. It better have really good spell effect, and it's not actually Summon a Random Murloc, it's Inspire Summon a Random Murloc. This is a card that might actually be worth playing on 4 without using your hero power immediately the turn it comes out, because 4 health is kind of big enough to risk it surviving. If you're paying 6 mana for this and your hero power immediately the turn it comes out, not quite good enough. That's a lot of mana to pay for a Murloc card. This card clearly gets its value if you can press the button 2 times, but it's going to be difficult to. It actually is worth playing it for 6 mana and using the hero power immediately, because you're getting like a 6 mana 4/5, and then the average Murloc. I haven't done the number crunching for this yet. I'm going to call the average Murloc to be something worth like 2 stats. That's probably underestimating the Murlocs. I'll call it a 2/3. So that would be like paying 6 mana for 6/8. That's actually not too bad. And of course, the Murloc Knight itself is a Murloc, which means that you can summon this again, and that would be one of the better ones. You can summon the Shaman ones. That would be pretty good. You can summon the War Leader, which is presumably insane. This card is going to be an obvious include if you have a Paladin Murloc deck. And in the case that you don't have a Paladin Murloc deck, it might just be good enough to, well, if you're thinking about using it as like a 6 mana, you play this and your hero power, and then maybe it survives for you to use another hero power. That's a little optimistic, and also you're getting a random Murloc. It also depends on the stats. Like I just assumed that a random Murloc was worth 2/3. But it's usually pretty confusing because the Murlocs tend to buff each other. I think it's a little too slow for Constructed in a non-Murloc deck, and Paladin Murloc decks obviously don't exist right now, but it's an interesting card nonetheless. In Arena, this card actually, I think, is going to be good enough, because you can actually get away with playing this on turn 6 and then using the hero power and then getting roughly 6/8 worth of value. Welcome to the new crew of vanilla minions, Pit Fighter. 5 mana 5/6 is actually pretty good. It kills the Lothab, kills the Sludge Belcher. This is actually possibly a game-shaking vanilla, like as exciting as you could make a vanilla, the missing link. It turns out that 5 attack is what's needed to kill a lot of the very popular cards right now. Lothab, Sludge Belcher, Sylvanas, kind of. 4/5s that exist, like Mechanical Yetis. Of course, you have the Emperor Thorsan. Has 6 health, so it usually survives trades against anything that's 5, because there's a lot of 5/5s out there. It's difficult to like hype up a vanilla card that much, and I don't actually think it's going to see constructed play. But if there were a vanilla card that weren't horrifically overpowered, then this card has the highest chance of making it into constructed. In Arena, this card's going to be a top pick. In a world where Arena Yeti is the king, Pit Fighter is the queen of Yetis. And that is one strong woman. 5 mana 5/4, which is Could it have cost 4 mana? Maybe, because the 4 mana 5/4 is no good. When you use the hero power, you gain a 2/2 squire to your hand, which is almost like drawing a card, because you're drawing a 1 mana 2/2 card. The squire is the attendant of the Silverhand Knight, and I've actually gotten my squire like freezing trapped or sapped, or actually I've never gotten my squire sapped, but like for some reason I just know the squire costs 1 mana. The Inspire is almost like draw a card. The card you draw is a 1 mana 2/2, which is efficient, but not really what you want in the late game. So it turns out that this card is too slow. It's interesting perhaps to compare this with Ancient of Lore a tiny bit, because you don't have to play this on 7 mana. I think the Inspire cards, which you don't have to play with the hero power specifically on a turn, are the more interesting ones. This one is like, okay, maybe you can get away without playing the hero power. Yeah, because the hero power isn't that necessary for this. A lot of the value of the card has been bundled into the stats a little bit. So if you were to play this in, say, Paladin, or, well, maybe we can call it even Warlock, then you can compare this with Ancient of Lore. You play this, Ancient of Lore is a 5-mana 5/5. You play it in Warlock, you play it as a 5-mana 5/4, you use the hero power, you draw a card, you add a 2/2 squire into your hand. It's almost like you drew 2 cards, and it's almost Ancient of Lore then. So, I think it could have been a 5/5. I think it could have, maybe 4 mana would have been a bit too cheap. It's like, when you reverse think about how valuable the hero power is, it's kind of interesting. And repeatedly people keep, I'll take this opportunity as a slight tangent, like, now that we actually have the full picture of the Grand Tournament Inspire cards, some people just keep dreaming of the world where they have like 3 Inspire cards out there, and then use the hero ability, and then you gain like a 2/2 squire, and then your minion gets +1 health, and then you summon a random legendary. But that world is never going to happen. I'm going to say that now that I've seen all of the cards in the set. Like, maybe there was some worlds where it could have happened, but the world where you actually trigger multiple Inspire effects by using one, like, hero power is going to be very rare. This card is fairly reasonably priced and valued, so it's alright. In Arena, this card's actually going to be somewhere between good and average, or maybe even, like, great. Because it is comparable to Ancient of Lore. It really is. I think valuing for Arena also kind of helps in the valuation for Constructed, because, at least initially, just looking at each card and wondering whether or not it's good value is a good way to think about it. Refreshment Vendor. This is probably going to be one of my favorite cards, as I am someone who does love control. So 4 mana, 3/5, that's fair. Restoring 4 health to each hero. Supposedly a card which is even, supposedly symmetric, but in control decks you usually don't care about your opponent's health, so it's almost like you can compare it to 4 mana, 3/5, restore 4 health to you. That's actually pretty good against aggressive decks, as it turns out. The stats are a lot better than Healbot. You get 4 less health, but it costs 1 less mana, and you get 2 extra health. I don't even think that it might be unreasonable to think that there might be a world where Healbot is replaced by Refreshment Vendor. Basically follows the same logic as Zombie Chow, where the 4 health you give to him is almost irrelevant. I like this Refreshment Vendor. It's certainly going to be a tech option that comes in if aggro ever runs amok, and this is exactly the type of card which is good to be able to push games into the later game so that you can use your hero power to get benefit from your Inspire, or just in general control. So, cool card. In Arena, it's more difficult to actually face off against an aggro deck, so it's actually going to be more like a 4 mana 3/5 vanilla, so it's actually one of those cards which is better in Constructed because you have a specific plan to outlast your opponent than in Arena, where it's usually just minion combat. Saboteur is a Loatheb for your opponent's hero power. 3 mana 4/3. I don't actually see locking out your opponent's hero power for a turn to be that valuable. It's not even going to be locked out in a turn that's that relevant. Basically, locking out your opponent's hero power is worth something, but it's not quite worth enough to put it on a 3 mana 4/3. I guess that's the most succinct way of putting it. In Arena, it's a 3 mana 4/3. It has a small benefit. It'll be like average. I guess I'll mention that if you're going second and you coin this out against a handlock, they are usually going to be doing the game plan of turn 2 tap, turn 3 tap, and then you lock out their option to turn 3 tap. Then they can't turn 4 giant. That's if you have the coin and they're going first. If you are going first, then usually they skip the turn 3 tap, and then it wouldn't do anything. But anyways, that's really specific against one specific deck, and still new. Seal of Champions is really comparable to Blessing of Might. So for 2 extra mana, you basically tossed in the Divine Shield. Divine Shield is kind of like worth 1 mana, but again, when you're lumping cards together, it's like you're drawing a card. One of the things that surprised me a little bit about Blessing of Might is that it's actually played in aggressive decks, although only 1 copy. And it made me realize that these buff cards are like 1 mana 3/1 chargers, so Blessing of Might could optimistically be thought of as 1 mana 3/0, but it has like charge, and so therefore you need to combo it specifically with a minion. Seal of Champions can be compared to kind of like a 3/1 with charge, but you need to specifically have a minion out already also. It doesn't quite serve the purpose that Blessing of Might does. It's just because it costs so little that it's used in the aggressive decks. It just costs too much. So, not good enough, I'd say. We got a 3 mana 3/3 for the Priest, and it's got a nice benefit to it. Priests tend to draw their cards in bursts, so that's a little interesting. Basically, those games where you're drawing a bunch of cards are the games that you already win, so you don't really need Shadowfiend to like win more. And when you're not winning more, you're basically getting a 3 mana 3/3. If you do manage to play this card in like the normal way, and you get a card reduction, then it's like a 2 mana 3/3. Like you can go Shadowfiend into Powered Shield and draw a card, reduce it by 1. But it's kind of difficult to justify playing a card where, not the best case, but the slightly above average case is that you get a 2 mana 3/3. The usual case is you get a 3 mana 3/3. Like sometimes you're going to get a -1 mana 3/3 worth of value because you play it and then you do like the Circle of Healing, draw a bunch of cards thing. But I think the Priest deck can't afford to put this card in. Doesn't have enough slots in it. In Arena, this card's going to be just fine. It's 3 mana 3/3 with an upside. I guess before moving on to the next one, sometimes chat manages to convince me of a certain card's worth. And in this case, like, okay, I will come back to it and like compare it to Flamewaker, for example, which is one of those cards where you play it and then it continues to get value over time. And that's one of the things I missed about Flamewaker. It's a big threat, and basically it has to be dealt with. Shadowfiend is the same way, because it's very limited kind of Thor Sand for exactly one card that it draws, but it's annoying enough that it basically has taunt. And if your opponent can't deal it, then okay, you get the benefit, and that's good. And maybe you get the benefit again, and you're using it in Priest, which can keep their stuff alive. You actually Shadowfiend, and then you put Powered Shield on it. That's actually really annoying to deal with. So I'm going to upgrade my opinion on this card to like tryable out in Constructed for sure. Shady Dealer. We got that Pirate synergy. The synergy isn't enough to justify this card, probably. So a 3 mana 5/4. That's good. I think decks would play a 3 mana 5/4. The problem is you need to specifically have a pirate out already, and that's tough. But yeah, it's a nice like kind of throw-in card. It's an option for the pirates. Even if you don't have a pirate, it's still 3 mana 4/3, and that's reasonable. People wouldn't laugh at you for playing a 3 mana 4/3. In Arena, it's going to be about average. Sideshow Spelleater, which is a really cool effect, and it replaces your hero power with their hero power. But the stats on it, 6 mana 6/5. Blah. So the question is like, how much more do you covet your hero powers? Because they're all roughly kind of the same in terms of value, unless specifically your opponent has become Jaraxxus or they've become Ragnaros. Nah, I don't really see this happening. It's a nice, cool tech card, and it's a fun card. I think it could have been a 6/6 and still wouldn't be played, but it's a 6/5. In Arena, like if you're a class with a bad hero power, such as Warrior, then you will pick Sideshow Spelleater a bit better. And of course, this will be a really fun card in Adventures. PvE content, boys. Ultimately, just kind of a cute filler card. A Warrior card pushing the taunt theme a bit more. This is a very fair card. 2 mana 3/2 taunt would already be like, okay, yeah, that's worth considering. But you also have a Battlecry, give a minion taunt. That's pretty cool. It's like Sun Fury Protector. It itself has taunt, and then it gives something else. This kind of pushes the bolster theme. It makes me think that bolster might actually be a thing. And we're actually going to end this half of the review on a very exciting card, which also has bolster value. Some extra foresight there. You can combo this with Black Knight, Very sick. Play this 2 mana, and then you Black Knight, and it's like 8 mana hard removal. Pretty cool. By the way, the battle cry is mandatory, so sometimes you have to give your opponent's cards taunt, but if you're playing a control deck with taunt, you usually don't care if your opponents have taunt, because you would usually be killing the opponent's cards anyways. So, it's a good card. Hard to justify the card when Sunfury Protector is nowhere on the radar for cards to put into any warrior deck. Has synergy with cards like Ancient Watcher, but Ancient Watcher isn't really on the radar for any of the warrior decks either. But it's a nice option. Spawn of Shadows. We've got Shadow Bomber's big brother. It's 4 mana 5/4, so the stats aren't very good. The Inspire effect, technically it's good for Priest, because you are killing your opponent faster than you, since you're usually going to heal yourself, or in the case that you're Shadow, you deal the opponent 2 extra damage. So it's pretty much always going to be like you get 2 damage net on them, but you would presumably play this in a aggressive aggro style of Priest, where 4 damage to them is more valuable than 4 damage to you. I don't really see this happening because Priest is kind of by design, based off the class cards and based off of the hero power, a deck that's meant to outlast your opponent, and there's so many control elements, it's kind of silly. Even if there was some kind of aggro Priest deck, you wouldn't run this anyways because it's a 4 mana 5/4 which does nothing on the turn that it comes out, and on turn 6, if you're getting to turn 6 with an aggro deck, you would use it, and then what, like, you're gonna heal yourself, you're gonna like have Alkanized Soul Priest out and heal them, or you're gonna have Shadow Form up? No, then you're not an aggro deck. Basically the card is not strong enough individually, and there aren't enough support cards to make this an actual deck. And even if there were an actual deck, this card would probably not be strong enough to make that deck. In Arena, this is a 4 mana 5/4 with possibly a slight upside, possibly a slight downside. It's kind of a wash almost. It's actually exactly even. I actually think this might be a downside in Arena, because Priests tend to have the really hard board control, like, over time plan. So in Arena, it's actually worse than a 4 mana 5/4. Probably. A Houndmaster-like effect in Stablemaster. It also has Beast Synergy. You're giving a friendly beast immune, so obviously you're intending to use it to kill an opponent's minion. And, you know, this might be difficult to understand for some of you Hunter players, but a lot of the Hunter cards have pushed the more control element of Hunter, the more late game Hunter, so I think this will work just fine. That is to say, though, that it is a 3 mana 4/2, so obviously you're gonna need to specifically get into a situation where you have a beast, you want to trade against an opponent's minion, you have a beast specifically that can attack also, and that becomes a little harder, because Houndmaster, you can actually play the beast and then just buff it, whereas Stablemaster, it's not nearly as exciting. It's difficult to justify 2 Houndmaster already. Some decks are doing it, and Houndmaster is a really strong card. Stablemaster just doesn't have quite as good the prospects, because like Houndmaster can target Haunted Creeper, but giving a 1/2 Haunted Creeper immune is almost pointless. Giving the Web Spinner immune is almost pointless. It just turns out that the +2/+2 is a much bigger buff. It's a fair card. I just don't see it as strong enough. In Arena, this card will depend on how many beasts you have. The more the better, of course. In an average case, it's probably slightly below average. And the card we're going to end this part of the review, stay tuned for the next one, Tournament Attendee. Be excited for the grand tournament. We're all attendees. We're all going to have the joy of being able to watch how this grand tournament unfurls. Stay tuned for the next part, Bolster Combo. Just kidding.